Welcome to the next session of this week, in which we are going to complete sessions for the past week as well as this one. And so we will release probably one of these every day. As the next step, yesterday we looked at how MySQL is set up and how the tables are set up and so on and so forth. And today we will see how it is that we use Java to extract data from MySQL. We have done this once before, but since it's been some time, I want to spend a little bit of time repeating that and then move on to how to do the same kind of thing from servlets and how to get database data and show it on a web page using JSP. So at this point, we will have brought together JSP and databases. And in the subsequent lectures, we will bring together cookies as well as the actual logic of the application. And soon our entire application will be essentially completed. So let's get going. All right. So let's see. Right. So the review is of how to access MySQL from Java, what database drivers are, what the database connection is, and how the result set object contains information about whatever the result of the statement from the database is and how we access it and convert it into HTML. All right. So here is the overall central picture that you should keep in mind. We have Tomcat, which is the server. Then there are servlets, which are classes, as we have seen, which get loaded when you configure them in the manager. Now, the change will be that our servlet will actually talk to the database driver and create what is called a database connection. A database connection literally represents, of course, the TCP connection between the Tomcat process and the MySQL process, but it also represents other data properties. Now, this is a somewhat complicated matter and we won't go too much into it. We will just use it without much ado. As we will see, it's not that difficult to use it. It's only when you get into the nuances of what it is exactly that a connection can do, which we won't need for our basic application. And on the other side, I have shown what happens when we are using the command line. The process is basically similar. The CLI also opens a connection, and it is through the connection that we talk to MySQL. Now, the arrangement of all this software is that the servlet is in Tomcat Web Apps. So to remind you of how the Tomcat layout gets done, let's go here and look at our XAMPP setup. So we have XAMPP here, and in this there is Tomcat, and in Tomcat there are web apps which contain all the web applications that we are going to use. So that's where the web apps themselves stay. Then there is a libraries directory which contains all these libraries, and in this library set, these are the libraries that are loaded by the Tomcat server on the fly whenever it needs some facility. And it also contains things like Tomcat API, etc., which we will see how to use for embedded Tomcat, etc. later. It contains the servlet API, which is itself used to compile the servlets and then used when we are loading them as well. Servlet, by the way, is not Tomcat specific. It is a Java standard, and so there are other non-Tomcat Java servers that also implement this standard. All right, so that's where this MariaDB Java client. As to why it is MariaDB Java client, that's just because MySQL forked into something called MariaDB, which is the open source version, as we have seen before. So servlet is in Tomcat Web Apps, driver is in Tomcat lib, and as it says here, interesting properties of transactions are managed on a per connection basis, and not having too many connections to the database is also important, although perhaps less so than it used to be. Nonetheless, it is an important factor. And so we are going to look at how the servlet and the database driver connection gets made by creating a simple example where we retrieve a bunch of information from the database and show it on the web page. The strategy is we will first have a simple file that helps us basically test that everything is going on. And whatever code is in this simple file is more or less in the first step identical code that we are going to put into our JSP, our servlet. Then we will take that simple code and instead do some more configuration stuff that a servlet needs for different purposes, as we will see in a little while. And in that case, what we will do actually is that, let me just write it down. So the next step here will be servlet configuration. So servlet Tomcat specific configuration, the same code that we use in our testing app can be used in a servlet, but there are limitations to that code. So you end up using something called JNDI resources. So for whatever reason, the Java world is full of all these acronyms, and as we have seen before, things are not really that complicated. The nomenclature and the ceremony around it is far more complicated than the reality of it. So a JNDI resource is basically a way of talking about databases without forcing ourselves to specialize to a specific database driver. So what all this means, it's easier to understand when I actually show you than to talk about it. Just remember that we will be doing this code in 2 stages. In the first or 3 stages, in the first we'll do our simple program, then we'll put it in a servlet, and then we will configure the servlet into a more, Tomcat friendly form. So that's what we are going to do. Okay, so let's get going. First, let's see here what happens. So the first thing we are going to do is this simple class readDatabase.java, and before you might forget, let's take a look at our MySQL. Just one moment. Let's take a quick look at the database first. So let's log in as NPTEL user, and we will use the database NPTEL. This database has these two tables that we created yesterday. Then after that, we can take a look at what users looks like. So it has these three attributes, and if we do select star from users, then we see the 3 users that we added yesterday. So today's goal is very simple. Today's goal is just to retrieve this select star from users and put it on a web page. After that, we will see how to get updates and whatever we need for our actual application. Right. Now that we have reminded ourselves of what this looks like, let's take a look at some simple code for retrieving information from this database using a programming language. First, we start off by creating a test class, and this URL is what is used by Java, or specifically there is another standard. Like I said, there is dozens of these acronyms in the Java world called JDBC, which is a way of connecting to any database, in this case MySQL. So what you say is the protocol is JDBC followed by MySQL followed by where it runs and so forth, and the last thing is the name of the database that you want to connect to. The other thing this connection needs is the user and the password, and finally the driver class itself, which we have already put in lib as we have seen before. Here are a few variables that are useful. Connection is the actual database connection. Then the statement you want to send to the database goes into statement, and the value of the statement comes back as result set. Okay. So first of all, we say identify this class which loads the class, and we say that this is our DB driver class. Then once we have the class, you get something called the driver manager. All of this is taken off automatically by the packages in the so-called Java SQL part of Java. And so you load this, establish a connection, create a statement, and the specific query we execute is select star from users, as I just said. When you get the result set back, the result set is an object that you can keep saying next. So this list of rows, one row at a time, is accessible through the result set. What happens here is that, see, you have user ID here, you have user ID here, you have ctime and ctime, and uname and uname. The types in this case are bigint and bigint, which are 64-bit types. So in Java they are represented as longs, and therefore we get that information using getLong, which is, so what the result set does is, if you get so many fields in a row, you can give each field a name, and you should know the type to which it is going to convert from the database type to the Java type, and accordingly you can use get methods to get the exact information back with the type you need. In this case, these two are longs, user ID and ctime, and uname is a string, so for which we don't need to do anything in particular. And once we have that information, we simply print it out. This is just a test. All three of these, the result set, the statement, and the connection, need to be closed when we are done with the actual job. In the test program, of course, it doesn't matter much at all. And if something goes wrong, we will print a stack trace and we will print a message. And in this case, of course, we know that not much is going to go wrong. So what we will do is, so we have our standard things to do. Compile this program with Javac. We have actually already probably compiled it, but just in case I made some changes. And so, as you might expect, you got all these three things, which means everything worked just fine. And by the way, I had already started this MySQL as you can see. So that's why everything is working just fine. Now, let's see what happens when we do exactly the same thing from a servlet. What does that look like? So for that, what I did was, we had a bunch of programs from last time. In particular, we had this material here, which is in all these things. So I took one of our programs from before, which is JSP forms, and copied it into DB forms. So if you take a look, this same structure is preserved: JSP, SRC, WebInf, etc. And you create DB forms. Now, what is different in DB forms is largely cosmetic. So we are going to talk to the database, but as far as the overall shape is concerned, it is exactly the same. There is a dbform.jsp, and we will be using that. So we have src, nptel, etc., and dbforms.java. I haven't even bothered to remove JSP forms sort of deliberately. This is not needed, but just to show you that it doesn't hurt anything, and you can make these changes gradually. Now, if we were working with Git or some other sort of technology that helps us in effect maintain copies in a systematic way, then we could use it. But for our teaching purposes, this is the simplest thing. And we have WebInf as before with WebXML, etc. So let's take a look at what all that looks like. So we have DB forms, and we are going to look at SRC, NPTEL, DB forms. So if you take a look at this, see, here is readdb.java, and here is DB forms. And what we have is more or less word for word the same thing. I just copied everything into a class, and instead of just having a straightforward class, now I have an extension of JDBC servlet. Not JDBC servlet, HTTP servlet, sorry. And we have these kinds of things because ultimately the goal is to print out a web page. So just like last time, you request and set attribute, etc., info via DB. And then you do the same thing. So we get this class for name. We have driver manager connection, create statement, etc., etc. The only difference is now we are going to decorate it with a bunch of HTML. We print this thing, print the beginning of the table, and iterate over. Meanwhile, after you retrieve these three things, you output these rows and close. So pretty much the same code. We transcribed it straight. The distinctions by and large don't exist. So whatever is happening here can as well happen with this code. And then we do the usual song and dance for creating war files, etc., which in this case we have already done. But just to show you, the jar statements are, let's see, where is the jar maker? So it's things like this. Jar for this thing. That was for a slightly different program. So, okay, forget about it. We will just type it again. So jar cvf dbforms.war, and as usual we have JSP and WebInf. Now we have, by the way, inside WebInf, and then if we create this, we will see what the contents are. So it takes all these things. The JSP, env, etc. aren't really used much. And here we have WebInf. Notice that it has both of these classes. JSP form, strictly speaking, is not needed at all. We take WebXML and change it as follows. So wherever there used to be, DB show and things like that. Oh, I opened the wrong WebXML. Web.xml JSP DB forms. This is okay. Okay, so this is DB forms, and so in the beginning, when you visit DB form itself, we will just go to / and then when it's clicked again, you open DB forms just like we did with JSP forms the last time. There's no difference. And then you deploy it as usual. You have seen that many times, so I'm not going to spend time doing that. Here we have our standard Tomcat, here we have a manager, and here we have DB forms. Now let's see what this thing does. So I'll remove all my earlier testing things. This is our latest. So I haven't changed anything. I just let the same template show up. So in this case, JSP and JSP.dbform.jsp. So you have your input and you have a button. We are not going to use any of this. This is just, copied existing code and made a small change just to show you how to make your own life simpler. Now just put in anything. We are completely going to ignore this. And when we press a button, instead of doing anything connected with the form, what is going to happen is that we are just going to get access to this DB forms. It ignores absolutely everything and simply runs the statement and returns the result. That's it. So, here we have our user table. So let's see, where did that come from? Here. So this user table showed up here. That's all we wanted to do. And this time we printed it by hand like this. Right? The next step then is just to wrap all this up in JSP, much the same way that we did for our earlier JSP forms program as well. To create the forms program this time with JSP, again I did the same thing, just took the DB forms program, copied it into this. And this time we are going to make two changes. First of all, instead of doing this kind of printing by hand, we are going to use JSP tags as we did last time. And for that, we have in Webinf these tag libraries. That's where the tag support is going to come from. And we have the standard thing, NPTEL, etc., DBJSP. So I have left all the previous ones as it is, and we will look at what DBJSP looks like. And here we have JSP, again the same kind of thing, DBJSP, etc. But this time we will be using this tag n file. So let's see what happens. On the left we have our new DBJSP, and on the right we have DB forms. The first change we make is, instead of explicitly loading the driver class directly, we are going to do it indirectly through the JNDI name. In part, it is to avoid having any knowledge like MariaDB, etc. embedded in this code, and instead move it into a config file, which config file we will look at in a minute. But as a consequence, you don't use the standard driver methods such as driver manager get connection URL. Instead, you do this somewhat different thing, where you first get a context, and then from that context you look up this strange looking thing. I don't actually know what all the bits and pieces here are, because this naming convention, whatever it is, involves deep knowledge of JNDI and context, etc., which we do not need for this case. So I do the same thing that you would do in this case, hunt around for examples of how to do it and understand just enough so that we can get the initial code working. Now, if I was doing this in a real life system, I would make sure that I understood every single detail, because doing this for an example is very different from doing it when you are actually in charge of the web application, because anything imaginable can go wrong and you need to thoroughly understand what is involved in running the system. But for our purposes, this just happens to be another way to get a connection. It doesn't matter too much. I'm showing this to you largely because this is how you will see it if you encounter this in a professional setting. Now let's see. So far so good. We created the statement and we arranged to get the result set, not too different from what we have here. Yeah. Okay. So the difference is, first of all, there is no string anything because we are going to use JSP. And here is the JSP which we are going to use. It's called user table. DB JSP user table. Okay. So this is our user table JSP. And remember, when we were first fiddling around with JSP forms, we had this code which looked like this, where what you have to do is, see, get something called a request dispatcher from the request itself, and then tell it to get access to this JSP, which then you end up calling this request dispatcher with the same request response that we had before, after putting these kinds of things into the request object. And this user table, again like the JSP from last time, has get attribute over here. And let me just remind you of the JSP from last time. So JSP, and we have JSP tag env. So here, remember, we were getting all these tables of attributes and parameters and so on. And the general idea is that we had this kind of for loop. So the same type of for loop exists here in user table, and it is the user data that we are going to populate in this statement. Once populated, you extract all these tidbits using these types of names which are specific to the way JSP tag libraries work. Okay, so you get the request dispatcher, and then this is what we do. We include the title, much like we included the title in this JSP form. So we had, remember, request set attribute title. Similarly, we have this request set attribute title, and the next attribute we set is to something called users data. Users data is populated from this function which says result set to a list of maps. So we are getting a set of rows. We model the row with a map, key value pairs, and we stick all the maps into a list, which is of course the list of rows that we got. Then you forward it to the request dispatcher, which will do the job of running user table.jsp, at which point this user's data and this user's data are the same thing, and the value of $users data is this users data object, which happens to be a list of maps. Okay, so what we did was we took DB forms, and instead of DB forms direct driver, we get it through this context object, and then instead of just pumping out HTML, we do what we did for our JSP forms and send it to a particular JSP, either JSP with ordinary JSP or using JSP tags. That's what we have over here. The only real novelty we haven't seen so far is two things. One is how did all this context and all this thing get set up, and what is this function doing? So first, let's take a look at this function. So I just wrote it over here. It's very simple. You get the result set. From the result set, you can get something called a metadata object, which tells us how many columns are there in the result set. And we will be using that information below. So you create a list, which is an array list, loop over rs next. For every row, you create a new hash map, which has the same number of columns as we got over here. And then for each of these columns, you start putting get column name and rs get object I, etc. So at the end of this, what we will have is this kind of thing. So what we will have is a database object corresponding to every row. We have the name of the column and the actual object, and you add that to the list. Return the value, put this value into set attribute, and then extract it in the user table library here. So the for each is done in JSP rather than doing it in code. By the way, notice one odd thing. Unlike the usual Java loop which goes over 0 to I less than columns, in order to keep interact properly with this metadata object, we have to loop from 1 to the end of the column. So that's a small little detail. And now let's see what we get if we look for this context thing. So the way the context thing gets set up is in this new directory called metainf in a context.xml file. Here what we say, and by the way, I took this straight from the Tomcat site, so you can take a look at the details yourselves. Basically, what is happening is you are describing to Tomcat what a particular data connection looks like. It says that it has all these things like max attrib, max idle, etc. And you can read what this says. It's mostly around managing the number of connections. And you have username and password, driver, class name, etc., etc. All of this then, because it's in the context.xml library, is accessible to our class, and therefore we are able to run this thing, initial context and data source. So this is the general idea in code like this. You get information from the database, you convert that into a data structure, you send that data structure back into a JSP library. The database itself becomes known through code like this, which talks about resources. But as far as the servlet is concerned, it does not need to know too much about the details of MySQL versus Postgres or whatever other database, Oracle, etc. that you are going to use. And you write the loop over here. For every field in the database, you can have a output that looks like this. And as we saw last time, in there is a work directory. There is a work directory. Let's go to this thing, for example. And in Tomcat, there is a work directory which converts all of these JSP files into Java code at runtime and loads it. And here we have, for example, user table JSP.java. It's kind of painfully difficult to read, but you can get some of the basic ideas of what is going on. Eventually you are going to get all these out.write statements from this code. So let's see what all that buys us. Okay. We have loaded this thing into the manager. This is JSP as usual. And now JSP, same kind of thing. You get the data back like this. Did you notice something odd here? The UID is empty, whereas here this is full because it happens to be spelled user ID. So this kind of thing, because of all this conversion from database to Java to this config to that config, can only be detected at runtime, which is one of the more unfortunate aspects of this type of programming. And to fix that, what we will have to do is to see that this can't be UID, but it has to be user ID. And then we go back and go to DB.JSP, use the jar file which mentions meta.inf and JSP. We only changed a config file, so we don't have to do much. So you create this thing. Let's load it into the manager. Stop this guy. Yeah, as usual, it every once in a while gets antsy about. There's either some bug or some subtle interaction, but it doesn't matter too much. So we have DB.JSP and we have DB.JSP.war, deploy it. Go here, register, and now our data is back. This is still called UID. See what I mean? There's always some small thing, because unlike this, which is used as a key, this UID is just text, and if we updated it, you would actually see user ID in both places. There is no simple way to verify these kinds of things, although it does mean that you need somewhat tedious testing every single time. You can do quite good testing with embedded Tomcat, which we will see in some upcoming session. So we have done something very simple. We now can successfully talk to the database and show a table. We'll build on this success and do the rest of the statements in subsequent sessions. Okay, so see you next time.